The ideas and themes of 20th century philosophy can never be explained as simply a reflection of the era's terrible military and political events. And yet, as I was suggesting in the last lecture, the philosophers, like everyone else, were forced to respond to the world in which they were living. There was no way to ignore this context. And we've seen how German philosophers and social theorists had to make very difficult choices during the Nazi era. But their situation was by no means unique, because the Nazi armies and occupation forces took control of many other European nations and forced intellectuals in places like France and elsewhere to choose sides. Wherever the occupying armies appeared, people had to decide what position they were going to take in this context. And if flight became impossible, if you couldn't leave, if you couldn't go into exile, you had to decide. You had to decide between collaboration with the occupying force or resistance or the silence of what came to be called internal exile. And the writers, like everyone else, had to make these decisions. Would you collaborate, resist, or simply fall silent and try to wait it out? And this was the military and political context in which French existential philosophy emerged during the early 1940s. The existentialists stressed the absurdity of human existence, but they also stressed the human freedom to make choices, no matter what the situation. And for various reasons, these ideas of existentialism seem to fit very well in the post-war context. And the period after World War II became the sort of high point of modern existential philosophy. The most important existential writers were the French authors Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir, all of whom in various ways responded to the German occupation of France, and all of whom stressed the importance of taking personal action. They didn't all act in the same way, but they came out of this experience saying human beings must choose to act. And so in this lecture, I want to discuss existential thought with reference to this context, to the context of the 1940s, and then suggest why existentialism gained so much attention in the decade after 1945. And I think the broad cultural interest in existential philosophy far exceeded the public interest in the more technical linguistic themes of Britain's logical positivism. We talked in an earlier lecture about the importance of linguistic philosophy in Britain, but the public never really took an interest in this. On the other hand, existentialism elicited enormous interest from people far beyond the university and far beyond academic circles. And I think the public response to existentialism grew in part from the literary skill of existentialist authors, who often wrote novels to describe their ideas or convey their ideas. And this was much more appealing to people than the technical writing of academic philosophers. But existential philosophy was also popular because it affirmed the value of human action. And so for all of its pessimism, in certain respects, it also had a rather optimistic claim that an individual human action could make some difference. And at the very least, it could define a meaningful life. So in contrast to the British linguistic philosophical concern with epistemology, the existentialists developed a new kind of concern with the problems of being and consciousness. This is what philosophers call the problem of ontology. The linguistic philosophers were concerned with epistemology, that question of how do we know what we know. But the existentialists focused on consciousness, on being, on the problem of reality and one's relation to it. And these ontological issues had already gained prominence in the 1920s and 1930s through the writings of philosophers such as Husserl and Heidegger, whom we've discussed earlier, and both of whom stressed the nature of existence. Heidegger and Husserl were very concerned with how one defines the meaning of human existence. Husserl had explored the ways in which a conscious subject becomes aware of the objects around it, the way in which consciousness interacts with the world. And Heidegger, for his part, had stressed that people must act to define their own being in the realm of time. And this concept of being would be very important for later existentialist authors. There were also other German philosophers who contributed to these ideas, one of whom was the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, who lived between 1883 and 1969. And Jaspers became well known for arguing that people must act with free will. He argued that human beings can act freely, and his thought also attracted wide attention. Jaspers said that it is the awareness of death that creates an anxiety in human beings. But it is also this anxiety about death that pushes people to pursue an active life. When you think about your own death, you feel a certain urgency to act in the world. And this is an interesting problem that the existentialists came back to again and again. How does the consciousness of your own death push you to take action? And the existentialists always put a lot of emphasis on that problem. Well, the French existentialists, especially Sartre, drew on all of these ideas to develop their own conception of free human action. And they explored the phenomenological question of how one becomes conscious of being in the world. And then they tried to link consciousness to free actions that could be used to affirm the individual's existence. There's a great deal of emphasis on existence and on action. So the German philosophical influences were crucial. The German thought of the early 20th century had an important impact on later existentialism. But the German occupation of France and the very painful experience of war, repression, and military occupation also contributed to the emergence and popularity of existentialism. So the Germans had both a philosophical and a material impact on the emergence of this movement. I want to turn now to the specific work and ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre, because he is the key figure in French existential philosophy. Sartre was born in 1905. He would live until 1980. And he was born into a well-to-do, highly educated family. He was the son of a French naval officer. But his father died when young Jean-Paul was only about 15 months old. And so he was raised, the young Sartre was raised by his mother and his mother's parents. His mother's family was originally from Alsace. They were a Protestant family, the Schweitzer family. This was the same family that included the famous Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who went on later to win a Nobel Prize for his work and his medical work in Africa. So Sartre came from a family of well-educated and distinguished people. As a child, Sartre was a bookish child. He loved books, but he seems to have been quite happy. At least he was fairly happy until his mother remarried when he was 11 years old. I guess he had a kind of Oedipal dream life as a child. His father had died, and he had his mother to himself, and he always reported later that he detested his stepfather, who appeared on the scene when he was 11 years old, and Sartre never reconciled with this stepfather. He went on to study at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, that training ground for people who wanted to become philosophers and teach philosophy, and he graduated first in his class at the École Normale. He was a top student and recognized from the beginning as an especially talented philosopher. He also, at this time, met Simone de Beauvoir, who was studying philosophy, although not at the École Normale. She was at the Sorbonne. But she was a brilliant student. They became partners at this time, studying philosophy and preparing for their exams to become philosophy teachers. And Sartre and Beauvoir became, in some way, life partners. They agreed at this time that they would live a totally, quote, transparent relation That is to say, they would be totally honest with each other. They would confess all of their personal thoughts and relationships. They would travel together, but they would also accept multiple sexual relations with other people. This was to be a totally honest, transparent relationship. And it was a relationship that would endure to the end of their lives, with some tensions, to be sure. But they remained intellectual partners throughout their lives. They never married, but their friendship survived all of their many affairs. Neither of them were ever willing to marry anyone for various philosophical and personal reasons. After completing his studies, Sartre went on to teach philosophy at a lycée in Le Havre, port city in western France. And he began to write fiction. He began to develop a plan to illustrate his philosophical themes through literature. And this was quite unusual because virtually no philosopher would think of illustrating his philosophical ideas through fiction. And yet this was one of Sartre's creative innovations. He would illustrate his ideas in literature. In 1933-34, Sartre had a fellowship to work at the French Institute in Berlin. And so he spent a year in Germany. He was actually in Germany during the first year that Hitler was in power. But Sartre was not interested in politics at this time. He seems to have been more or less oblivious to what was going on in this very critical moment in German political and social history. He was studying the philosophy of German philosophers. He was reading the works of Husserl and other German authors. And when he went back to France, he set about writing fiction that would somehow illustrate the phenomenological ideas that he had encountered in Germany. And his first published novel, which was called Nausea, was published in 1938. And it is in many ways an example of this phenomenological exploration of consciousness. The main character is a man named Antoine Roquentin. And Antoine sort of passes his life traveling around to cafes and thinking about his own existence. And he explores both his physical and mental being, almost like an object to be observed. He'll stare at himself in the mirror, for example, becoming conscious of himself as a physical object, just in the kind of phenomenological mode. And it is the pain of this self-exploration which induces feelings of nausea. And Antoine becomes a kind of literary example of the existential crisis, the crisis of consciousness that leads finally toward the self, the consciousness of mortality, the consciousness of one's physical existence. Well, Sartre had difficulty getting his work published in the beginning, like most young authors. And even though he finally got the novel Nausea published in 1938, he remained very little known at the time France went to war with Germany in 1939. He was drafted into the French army, and then he was captured, taken prisoner with his military unit in June of 1940 during the catastrophic French military campaign when the Germans conquered France in June of 1940. And he spent the next 9 months in a German prisoner of war camp, where he wrote extensively in journals and continued to develop his thought. He was finally released in March of 1941 under somewhat mysterious circumstances. It's never been known exactly how he got out of prison, but he then returned to France and remained in France during the occupation. Now, before the war, Sartre had shown very little interest in public action of any kind. But the war and the German occupation pushed him in a new direction. He joined as a writer into the campaign of the resistance, those people who were trying to resist the German occupation. He was not a particularly active member of the resistance. He certainly was not involved in any of the clandestine military activities or things like that. But he began to write plays about the necessity of making choices, about the problem of being free, and how one resists forces outside the self. And in that sense, he made a kind of literary contribution to the evolving ideas and movement of the French resistance. And after the liberation in 1944, he went on to make a 4-month trip to America. He was sent there in part as part of the American-French attempt to reestablish connections after the war, and he spent 4 months in early 1945, and then returned to Paris, where he soon became an extremely famous public intellectual, much like Voltaire in the 18th century, an intellectual who published in all kinds of publications, who wrote in many genres, including fiction, drama, philosophy, political essays, and all kinds of commentaries on public affairs. He was the model of a kind of Enlightenment-style intellectual. He also wrote for the general public, and one of his most famous essays was called simply Existentialism is a Humanism, which he wrote in 1945. And this essay was an example of his ability to popularize philosophical ideas for a broad public. And in his work, Sartre argued that the world has no intrinsic meaning because there is no God, there is no higher reality to give meaning or truth to human beings. So we could say that Sartre was an atheistic existentialist. In this respect, he was closer to the tradition of Nietzsche than to the Christian existentialism of someone like the 19th century philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard stressed also many of the existential themes, but always insisted on the existence of God. But Sartre stressed that individuals are both alone and alienated from each other. So there is no essence. There is only existence. Or, as Sartre puts it in a very famous phrase, existence precedes essence, which means there is no eternal soul. There is nothing that lives on beyond the physical being of the individual. Now, each individual, as Sartre described it, each individual must pass through an existential crisis in which he or she recognizes the absurdities of existence. What makes life absurd? Well, the inevitability of death, that issue of death again, you must die, or the nature of solitude, or the difficulty of communicating with other people. These were themes that Kierkegaard had already developed in the 19th century, that when you confront honestly the nature of your life, there's something deeply absurd about it, including your own death. And yet, the painful confrontation with the absurd, meaningless human condition does not have to lead to complete despair. Because even within this absurdity, the individual can see that human consciousness exists in spite of the absurdity. So above all, there is that consciousness, the thinking, conscious human being. And human beings have the freedom to act, drawing on that consciousness. So the human mind and human acts can give meaning to individual lives and to the social world. That's why there's not complete absurdity, there is meaning. How does this meaning come about? The meaning of individual life comes about through actions that each person takes. There is no fixed essence, but there is human actions. In other words, you are what you do, and you define yourself by your acts. And in Sartre's words, this is a quote, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. And full responsibility for his existence rests on him." You have to take full responsibility for your actions. But there's nothing else. You are what you do. Now, since human beings have no essence, they are always in a process of becoming. They have a radical freedom to become what they choose to be. But Sartre insisted that most people refuse to act with this freedom. They have what he called bad faith because they let others define who they are. And in order to be an authentic human being, Sartre said, you must use your freedom. If you don't use your freedom, you're abdicating your human ability to act in the world. So, for example, you may go around the world saying, "I am an artist," but you are not an artist unless you actually create something. Or you may say, I am very political, I'm involved in politics, but you are not a political person unless you act politically. You can't just sit in the cafe and talk about what you are what you do. And your actions will always define your existence. In other words, you must make choices. And even refusing to make choices is a choice. And as Sartre pointed out, this is the choice most people make most of the time. Rather than taking a clear action, taking a strong action, they don't do anything. And yet, in that non-action, people are, in effect, making a choice. Now, in the early post-war period, Sartre was critical of communism. But in the early 1950s, and throughout the 1950s, he worked increasingly to link existentialism with Marxism. And this was a philosophical and political move on Sartre's part that angered many of his friends and allies. It seemed to violate his main themes. It seemed to abdicate the individual to something beyond the individual. But Sartre became a strong advocate for various anti-colonial revolutions. He condemned the French policies in Algeria, and he stopped writing fiction and gradually lost much of his philosophical influence in the later 1950s and 1960s. And yet his account of how human beings must create meaning through free actions, through free and decisive actions and choices, retained a great deal of cultural influence. And he also had cultural influence through a journal that he had created with his friends and allies, a journal called Les Temps Modernes, Modern Times, which was a place that many of the most important writers of the period published their work. So Sartre was almost a cultural industry with his own publications and with his own journal. Now, this emphasis on the need to take action in an otherwise absurd world appeared also in the work of Albert Camus. And I want to say a few things now about Camus. Camus lived from 1913 to 1960. And he regularly denied that he was an existentialist. And in fact, he eventually had a bitter falling out with Sartre. But many of his themes resemble the key ideas of existential thought. And he has often been linked to existentialism despite his own protestations against certain aspects of existential philosophy. Camus was born in Algeria. He had a Spanish mother and a French father. But his father was killed at the Battle of the Marne in 1914, another example of a family that was in some way shattered by the First World War. And so, like Sartre, young Camus grew up very close to his mother and without a father. But Camus came from a much poorer family than Sartre did. His mother lived in poverty and supported herself by cleaning houses in Algiers. So Camus had very little money. But he was an outstanding student who won scholarships, and so he was able to attend the University of Algiers, where he studied philosophy. He married in 1934, but that marriage quickly dissolved within a couple of years. And then he later married again a woman named Francine Faure. He had a couple of children. But he was mostly devoted to his writing and to his work. He suffered from tuberculosis and health problems throughout his life, and he was unable to serve in the military because of these health problems. But during the war and the German occupation, he became a very active journalist. Camus wrote for various resistance publications, and eventually he became an editor of a newspaper called Combat, that continued to publish after the liberation. Combat was very well known as a center of resistance writing. But in the midst of this journalism, he was also writing novels and drama. His first novel, The Stranger, appeared in 1942. And this work is one of the places where people have often seen the themes of existentialism, because it's a novel about an alienated character, a man named Meursault, who, for no particular reason, murders an Arab man on the beach in Algeria, blinded by bright sun, he sort of absurdly just kills the man for no apparent reason. And Meursault never seems to find anything that is important or meaningful to him. The world seems absurd. Even his own mother's death evokes no feeling from Meursault. And he goes to his own death, he's put to death for this murder, he goes to his own death with a strong sense of the absurdity of life. He's a stranger in the world in which he lives. So there is in some of Camus' work a strong sense of the absurdity or purposelessness of life. And yet Camus moved on in his post-war work to affirm that human choices can make a difference in the world. And this is suggested very clearly in his later novel, The Plague, which was published in 1947. This novel used the metaphor of a plague in a North African city to evoke the experience of World War II and the occupation. It's sort of a metaphor of people who are trapped in a city. No one can go out or come in, much like during the occupation of the war. The main character is a doctor, a man named Dr. Rieu, who struggles to act against forces he simply can't control. The plague, it's something you're presented with. You can't control it. So the question then is, how do you react to what you are given? And the narrator of the novel notes that Rieu's belief suggests you have to take action. And this is a quote from the novel, that a fight must be put up in this way or that, and there must be no bowing down, end quote. In other words, a doctor must try to save others. He must work to fight the plague. Even though he didn't choose the plague, he can't control the plague, he has to fight against it. And Camus believed that plagues took many different forms. The plague could come in many ways at many times, but the greatest danger emerged when human beings could not be free. That was the worst plague of all. And so, in contrast to Sartre, Camus condemned communist repression in Eastern Europe. He also refused to support the Algerian Revolution. This was a great crisis in Camus' life because he came from Algeria. He identified with the French settlers who had lived there for generations. He could never fully embrace the cause of the Algerian Revolution. And this kind of choice, both his critique of communism and his critique of the Algerian Revolution, separated Camus from Sartre and from many other French writers in the 1950s. But as Camus saw it, the imperatives of human freedom justified the political choices he made. He felt that his side was a defense of freedom. Well, as it happened, Camus himself died rather absurdly in a car accident at the age of 46. We don't know what else he would have done if he had lived to a full lifespan, but he died at age 46 without reconciling with Sartre, who had been a friend during the Second World War and during the time they were both writing in resistance publications. But despite their differences, Sartre and Camus came out of the Second World War with a shared belief that human freedom could make a difference in an absurd world, that human action gave purpose and meaning to what was otherwise a meaningless existence. Now, from the beginning, there were many critics of existentialism. And many of these critics said that the philosophy was flawed because it was too subjectivist. It placed truth in the hands of the individual actor, or it assumed that individuals were free to do whatever they wanted to do. And the critics said that existentialism did not understand the social and cultural and psychological constraints on individual action. In fact, this critique of existentialism may partly explain Sartre's move toward Marxism. I think he wanted to show that existentialism could have a strong collective or social agenda. It could take a collective action. There were other critics who saw in existentialism a kind of naive optimism, an optimism that said even amid the absurdity of this world, individuals are free, they can be whatever they want to be, they can do whatever they want to do. And many critics said that's not true. The constraints of social and historical conditions are such that people are not really free. And yet, I think this idea that humans are free, that human action does make a difference in a senseless world, was very appealing after 1945. And it was an idea that other writers would pick up in their own ways in post-war literary works.